Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first talk in the Curatorial Development Program's Public Talk Series by Dr. Patrick Corner. I'm Hattie, Assistant Curator of the China Trade Art Team at the Hong Kong Museum of Art. The Curatorial Development Program is sponsored by the Helen Kwok Foundation and the Friends of the Hong Kong Museum of Art. It is an initiative to invite distinguished scholars from abroad to visit Hong Kong and to cultivate international exchanges on the arts. With the support of this sponsorship, we are deeply honored to have Dr. Patrick Corner from England to conduct a research visit at the Hong Kong Museum of Art. May I take this opportunity to express on behalf of the museum my sincere gratitude to the Friends of the Hong Kong Museum of Art for the generous support for this project. Dr. Corner is an internationally renowned scholar specializing in the China trade paintings. He has published extensively on the pictures from the Far East, especially those of artist George Chinnery. Dr. Corner currently serves as the Museum Expert Advisor for the Leisure and Cultural Service Department, and he is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society. He was also formerly the keeper of fine arts at the Royal Pavilion, art galleries and museums in Brighton. The title of today's talk is China Trade Paintings, New Evidence, Old Deceptions. Dr. Corner will draw on newly available evidence to question some previously accepted ideas about China trade arts and propose new ones. Now, may I invite Dr. Corner to deliver the talk, please. Dr. Corner, please.
Well, thank you very much, Hattie. Am I audible? Please do wave if you can't hear what I'm saying. I hope I can live up to what you've just said I'm going to do. I have to make clear at the outset, if it's not clear already, that I'm not a sinologist. My knowledge of traditional Chinese culture is only skin deep, very thin skin at that. Really, I'm qualified to be giving this talk only because in the course of my career as a museum curator and also in the commercial art world, I've looked at a lot of Chinese export paintings, otherwise known as China trade paintings. And what I hope to do in the course of this afternoon is to persuade you, if you're not already persuaded, of how interesting they are and how attractive they are in very many cases. So just to recap, if I may briefly, on how I got interested in the subject. This is where I worked for 12 years, this very odd-looking building in Brighton on the south coast of England, built externally in a largely Indian style, an Indian fantasy style, internally Chinese. And part of the same organization are what were the royal stables, now the museum and concert hall. And these were the creation of one of our more extraordinary monarchs, who became King George IV. Now, in most ways, he was not in any way an admirable person. He was egocentric and extravagant and unpopular, but he was an aesthete. He was very interested in art and design and style, and had a particular interest in China, not because he ever went anywhere near China, he scarcely went outside Britain, but he wanted to be as different from his subjects as he could possibly be. Here's the music room at the pavilion at Brighton. I should say that Queen Victoria sold the place to the town of Brighton in 1850, and the town has owned it ever since. Here is the music room now, and he imported, first of all for his London palace, and then for his palace by the sea in Brighton, all kinds of objects from China. That meant porcelain and lacquerwork and clay models of Chinese figures. And what he couldn't get from China, he had made in London or Paris in what was thought to be a Chinese style, chinoiserie, in other words. And here you can see these tall pagodas and vases. They're Chinese exports, but then as soon as they arrived, there'd be gilt bells and dolphins and mounts added, and they'd be displayed in that form. Now, he also acquired a lot of Chinese export pictures. And this is his yellow drawing room. It didn't last long because he kept changing his mind and coming up with new designs. But here you can see that the walls are lined with, in fact, Chinese export pictures. Let's just see, I think I've put in a detail or two. And you can almost see what kind of picture they are. I think the one at the bottom is something like this. And a Chinese export picture is basically an amalgam of Chinese and Western styles. It's often a Western theme, but presented in a way that was more acceptable to Western tastes. And almost all the export paintings were produced in Canton between about 1740 and the early 20th century. This particular one was painted in oil. They started painting in oil on canvas in about 1780. And one other room, again, full of Chinese export paintings, the red drawing room. And if you look closely at the pictures on the wall, again, you can almost see what sort of Chinese export picture they were. Not quite sure if they were oils or in watercolor, but they would, looks like a pavilion in a formal garden. The whole subject of Chinese export art is quite a new one. The phrase was hardly used before about 1950. And Chinese export painting, that phrase was hardly used before the 1970s. These are two of the pioneering books, the one on the left mostly about England, the one on the right mostly about America. And there's a subsequent edition of Carl Crossman's book, still probably the most comprehensive book on the subject. And I should say that the more recent books on this subject are actually published in China, and they're either bilingual or they're in Chinese with English summaries. And I think this reflects the fact that there's been a move in both public and scholarly interest, perhaps away from Europe and America, towards this part of the world. And if you want to see Chinese export pictures and paintings, of course they exist in England and in Europe, but they're hard to find. It's hard to find dedicated displays or exhibitions of them. Whereas if you come over here, there are several museums in Guangzhou. I've put two of them in on the left, and two excellent examples, the Maritime Museum across the water and the Museum of Art in which we sit, in which such things can be seen. This is the fairly new 13 Hongs Museum with a huge reproduction of a Chinese export view of the Canton factories inside. I could also mention other museums where there are collections of Chinese export pictures to be seen, also Taiwan, Singapore, and one non-Eastern remarkable exception, that's the Peabody Essex Museum in Boston, which has perhaps the world's best corporate collection of Chinese export paintings. You should definitely go and see it if you ever have the chance, although not as many as I would like are on display. So let's look at a few Chinese export pictures. One thing that the Europeans who visited China were agreed on is that the Chinese artists, however deficient they might be in European eyes in things like perspective and shadowing, they were excellent artists when it came to botanical subjects, natural history, plants, birds, insects. And this is a lychee or lychee drawn. This was, of course, a fruit unknown in Britain at the time, by a Chinese artist for John Bradby Blake, who went out as a merchant, a supercargo with the East India Company, and he commissioned the Chinese artists to make a large number of these botanical drawings, but in a way that he felt would be particularly appreciated back home. So they're like a natural history lesson all in one go, showing the nut and the berry and the underside of the leaf and the ripe fruit, the unripe fruit, and the local name as well. One of the biggest collectors was a man called John Reeves, who was the East India Company's inspector of teas in Guangzhou for quite a long time, and then succeeded by his son. Extremely well-paid job. And this is a painting by George Chinnery, the British artist who was out here. And I was walking through Kowloon Park the other day, and lo and behold, there was one of the many plants named after reeves. Apparently you make rope from the bark. And there are hundreds, possibly even thousands, of drawings in London by Chinese artists who were employed by reeves to send back pictures like this. These are crustacea, very carefully drawn, all with inscriptions. And I couldn't resist putting this in. This is a leopard cat. And apparently this is the first cat species to become a human domesticate. This was in Neolithic China about 5,000 years ago. And I put it in because it's a recent descendant of Bengal cats, and we have one at home. And I thought she would like to put in an appearance here in Hong Kong. I think she'll be very pleased to have been observed. And also, rather interestingly, there's a Chinese export picture of John Reeves's own office. So this is by a Chinese artist. And interestingly, almost all the objects there would have been made locally. They could all be described as Chinese export furniture, perhaps not the upholstered sofa or the faux marble fireplace, but pretty much anything else. So what were the Europeans particularly interested in? Well, they were interested in tea, in silk, in cotton, in rice, and series of paintings of, in this case, silk production would be sent back. This one is around about 1800, painted in gouache, that's opaque watercolor. They were usually sets of 12 or 24, and this will be one of the first one. They're throwing down the mulberry leaves to gather the mulberry leaves which the silkworms are going to feed off. And I won't show them all, but here we are warming the trays which have the silkworms spread out on them. Lovely blue sky, they're idyllic scenes. No clouds, no rain. Here they are heating the cocoons, winding the silk thread, a little detail of heating the cocoons. Or here they're warping, I think is the technical term, preparing the warp by rolling all the warp yarns onto a beam and making sure that you've got the same tension all the way across before they are woven, interlaced with the weft. Oh, you can see the children playing on the palm leaf. I'll just point that out again in a moment. Or here they're dyeing and then finally weaving the designs into the cloth. Just the detail of that. Very clear, simple idiom that Westerners could understand, usually shipped in albums. Now, of course, these are highly idealized scenes, as indeed are most landscape paintings all over the world. Perhaps this is a more realistic view of what took place. This is a photo of silk manufacture in Macau in the 19th century, but they weren't supposed to be realistic. They were simply supposed to be attractive and colorful, while at the same time illustrating the traditional stages in the silk-making process. Now, the origin of these scenes, the traditional Chinese designs go back a long way to the Southern Song, to the 12th century, when a series of pictures of tilling and weaving, as they're often described, were produced. This particular set was produced for the Kangxi Emperor by the court artist Zhao Bingzhen, who had trained with the Western Jesuits at the imperial court. And you can see it's a half-westernized version of the Gengzhi Tu, in which Western perspective is introduced to a certain extent. You've still got the Chinese script, and what seems to happen is that gradually, in the course of the 18th century, versions of these sets get produced which, stage by stage, are more interesting and attractive to potential Western buyers. Here they're warming the cocoons. Here they're warping. And if we compare the Kangxi warping set with the export set, you can see that although it's in fact reversed, the design is reversed, and there's this Western-style landscape introduced, actually the main protagonists are pretty much the same. The three women are in exactly the same position. The children are doing exactly the same thing. The one lying on the ground is banging on a drum in both cases. And throughout the process of moving from the Chinese to the westernized version, you get the same thing again. You can see the central figures very much the same, although the background is different. And here are the equivalent pictures but of rice farming. This is the Kangxi version. Here they are watering the young rice plants. And then gradually the Chinese text is phased out because none of the Europeans could read it anyway. And the pictures got a little bit more attractive to Europeans. And then finally you get these ones around about 1790, 1800 with these clear blue skies. And if you put the three together, you can see the changing background, but actually the central figures, they're all doing the same thing, they're all looking in the same direction. It was obviously felt important that the crucial elements of these sets be kept the same. And even when back in England engravings were made of these sets, the five figures in the foreground are still in exactly the same situation in relation to each other. And there are similar sets of tea. This is tea growing near Hangzhou. And I've just put in one or two from different tea sets. This is around about 1780, I would say. By this stage, they've brought the tea all the way down from the tea-growing districts. They're emptying it out in a Guangzhou warehouse. And the Chinese and Western merchants are sitting together at the table, working out how much it's all going to cost. And here they are trampling it down in the tea chests to make it, to pack in as much as possible before it was put on board the ship. Once again, the Western and Chinese merchants. But these natty little conical hats that the Westerners wear, I'm not sure whether they were to protect the Westerners' hair or to protect the tea from the Westerners' hair. So, if anybody knows, I'd be interested to learn. And this is a large Chinese export gouache, this time done for the Danish Asiatic company. And you can see that each different tea chest is being carefully marked. It's B for Bohea tea, and CP identifies the ship, the Kronprinsen. And in fact, Professor Paul van Dyck, recently retired from the Sun Yat-sen University, has actually identified the probable date in which this picture was made, 1783. So it's amazing what can be inferred. Now this is one of a wonderful set of 34 scenes illustrating the production and the transport and the sale of porcelain, which you can see in the Maritime Museum, the other side of the harbour. They're one of my favorite sets, very lively and quite an early set in which the Chinese element is still rather strong. I've just put in a few sample scenes. Here they're pulverizing the clay with a water-driven steam hammer in the hills above Jingdezhen. And here they're sieving the powdered clay. I think this is the only scene in which women appear. All the rest are men. You can see the little gilt outlines of the tea bowls and the headdresses. And all sorts of ingenious ways of spinning the wheel on which the bowls are going to be made. Jumping a long way ahead, here they are stacking the kiln with those sagas, the ceramic containers which protect the porcelain from direct contact with the flames. Now they're painting in enamel colors, still in Jingdezhen. Here's a detail. You can understand that he needed his glasses. I would think a lifetime spent painting in these colors would certainly do something to your eyesight. And then the Jingdezhen dealer is giving a banquet for the Canton merchant with these polychrome plates and bowls. Absolutely delightful detail in this set. And there's a servant holding a silver glazed wine jug on the right there. And now there's the long journey to bring the porcelain down from Jingdezhen to Guangzhou. Then the scene changes, and now we've got the Westerners, and they're coming up the Pearl River. They're being rowed up from their anchorage in small boats. You've got a worried-looking Westerner under his canopy there, being rowed up to Canton. And here we've got the Westerners being introduced. I don't think we can regard these as realistic, but nevertheless a nice picture of the Westerners approaching a shop. Here we see them in detail. There's the servant, obviously depicted a bit smaller than the other Westerners, and he's holding a massive sack of money, I suppose, with which to pay for the porcelain. And here, if you look closely into the pictures, you can see all the extraordinary shapes and sizes and colors of the porcelain itself. So that's a great series. This is one of the larger ones. Here you see them packing the porcelain, ready to bring it back. The astonishing thing is how much of the porcelain made it back, and all the wrecks that are fairly regularly brought up from the bottom of the ocean. Amazing how many of the porcelain bowls are still in one piece. Here they're, I think, packing it with sago. They use various different methods of packing. You could always eat the sago if things got really bad. And here's a Westerner pinging a bowl to make sure there's no hairline crack in it. And if there is, it's going to get thrown there onto the floor. Here we've got a bit of sacking, a bit of straw being used for the same purpose. Now, just want to mention glass, because painting on glass is some of the most interesting, I think, and fascinating Chinese export painting. In the 1700s, or in the 17th century, I could say, it was really only France and England, particularly France, who could make large-scale plate glass. And this was sent out usually with a mirrored back, usually for diplomatic purposes, to India, to China, elsewhere. Large mirrors were very much prized. And here you can see these are the presents made by the 17th century Dutch ambassadors to the emperor. Let me get the pointer going. A looking glass here, 4 looking glasses with painting on. This is in the middle of the 17th century. So at some point, at about this time, the idea of sending painted glass seems to have taken hold. Well, this is just a picture of these massive plates of glass being made by casting, developed in France, and you'd run out the molten glass onto a large flat table and roll it and then cool it slowly. And by 1700 or so, the Vauxhall glassworks could do it too. And here's a picture of a Cantonese artist painting on the back of a bit of glass. It was always the reverse of the glass that you painted, not the side that you would look through as a spectator. And he's either copying a European print or he's copying a copy of a European print. You can see he's got a flat piece of wood positioned across the back of the frame so he doesn't crunch the glass with the heel of his right hand. He's holding the brush, of course, in the Chinese style, although he's got a Western style palette beside him. And quite a lot of the early glass paintings, reverse glass paintings that were produced in Canton were in fact copies of prints. Here, for example, is an engraving of an English estate, a landscape garden at West Wickham, the Dashwood family's estate. And I've just superimposed the Chinese glass painting on top of it. Just shows you how much more attractive the glass painting is than the... maybe I can just go back again. I mean, there is something rather wonderful, I think, about these. If you compare them with the glass paintings that Europeans were doing at the time, the Chinese ones are somehow so much more attractive. Just go back again. It's actually a very careful copy, but very effective. Well, here on the left-hand side, you've got an English engraving of a courtesan looking up flirtatiously at the artist. And on the right-hand side, you've got the copy by the Chinese expert and export artist on glass. And although it's a copy, it seems that the Chinese artists were able, or maybe even were encouraged, to make a few changes to the details and to the colors. So you can see, for example, that her ankle is a good deal thinner than the original English ankle. And there's this rather delightful little blue shoe. It's a much smaller foot, I feel, than the English artist ever considered. And if you look at the letters of assignation up behind the courtesan, again, the Chinese artist he's basically given her a free weekend. He's taken a few of the assignations away. And obviously there must have been one or two expert Chinese artists who were particularly good at European script. I think Wednesday there is not quite spelt right, but really the lettering is beautifully done with all the serifs and so on. A lot of the early ones have painted flowers all around the outside, and occasionally birds and insects. And then gradually you start seeing portraits appear, sometimes very small ones at the bottom. Well, this is a half-scale portrait, until the portrait became the main point of the picture. And in fact, this picture here is perhaps the earliest datable Chinese export painting that we know of. And it's a painting of John Pike of the Swedish East India Company. Now, we know that he made 4 trips to China, the first in 1732, the last in 1744, so it probably dates from, well, it's bound to date from between those two. The frame, I should say, was added in Sweden. Here he is again. And the Swedes, I think, are the dark horses of the China trade. They are really particularly interesting, considering they were a small country with almost no colonies. They couldn't compete with the heavyweight players, that was the British and the Dutch. Here is their former headquarters, which is now the City Museum in Gothenburg. And they formed in 1731 the Swedish East India Company. They were a group of outsiders, I think you'd say. They were a group of entrepreneurs, mostly Scottish and Swedish, but with some English, some German, some Dutch. And some had been involved in the Ostend Company, which hadn't worked out. Some of them were people who felt opposed or rejected by the East India Company. All of them wanted to make a lot of money, and in fact they succeeded in doing so. Especially the first 30 years, they were hugely successful. And the way they did it was that they imported tea especially, and other things, into Sweden, immediately sold it at auction, to wholesalers, to the other European ports, with no customs duty coming in and only a tiny customs duty going out. It's a kind of Hong Kong story, I feel, here. These are free traders who are exploiting their international connections and their mercantile savvy to make themselves extremely rich and to avoid all the restrictions and complications that were involved in working through the East India Company. Also, it was very difficult to get a job with the East India Company unless you had particular connections. So Colin Campbell, this Edinburgh-born entrepreneur on the right, was the motive force behind it. I've just put in a map just to remind you of where Sweden is, in case you've forgotten, and just to show you what a long way it is from China. Probably nowadays it's quicker to go over the pole, I don't know. But you have to time your voyage quite carefully if you're going out to Canton in a sailing ship. You have to hit the East Indies, Indonesia as it now is, at about the right time in the summer to catch the winds that will take you on up to the Pearl River. And if you're late, then you may have to spend the whole winter in Batavia or Jakarta as it now is, and you might waste an entire year. And obviously this was a very expensive thing to do. I don't want to labor this point too much, but here's Sweden again, and here I've put a white line under Gothenburg to remind you that it's a cold and snowy place, and if you're not careful, you can get iced in. And in fact, one of the early journeys, which I'm just going to talk about in a moment, the ship that William Chambers was on, come to him in a second, the ice was so bad they couldn't leave till April. They made their way around one of his, I'll just stick with this. They were too late to catch the winds, and to cut a long story short, the journey took 31 months when they were hoping for 17. They still made a profit. In fact, I read somewhere that in the first 30 years, the average profit was 37%, even counting the ships that went down, as several did. Now, one thing about these Swedish importers was they were interested from the outset in bringing back paintings. It wasn't just tea. Tea was, of course, what made the most of the money. They also brought back lacquer work, and they brought back pictures, and we can see they're now online, the catalogues. This is the auction sale. This is the first page of Chinese paintings. These are all Chinese paintings, which were sold at auction as soon as they came home. And this is a chap called William Chambers, who is much better known in England anyway as the leading British architect of the late 18th century. What is not remembered so much is that he started out as a young merchant with the Swedish East India Company. In fact, he was born in Sweden, born in Gothenburg, and throughout his life he spoke Swedish to his Swedish friends and English to his Scottish and English friends. And when he was only 17, he joined the Swedish East India Company. He made 2 voyages to China, and only then did he decide to become an architect. And he sailed to China in a ship that looked like this. This is actually a replica, which sailed out, in fact, it came to Hong Kong, didn't it, in something like 2005, on the way back from Shanghai. I went on board it when they were being built, and they were very reluctant to show one the fact that it had a very small motor on board, so it wasn't quite a replica of the original ship. Oh, here she is in Hong Kong. And this is a map made by one of Chambers's shipmates. You can just see, the voyage which they made around here. Another disadvantage which the poor old Swedes had is that if you come down this way to the English Channel, the wind is against you down there. So the quicker thing to do is to go to the north of Scotland, which is up here. But the north of Scotland is a nasty, treacherous place, and actually 3 of the early ships were all wrecked off either the Aucklands or the Shetlands. So whichever way you did it, you had problems. So hats off, I think, to the Swedes for making such a success of it. Just to show that awkward little bit. And happily, a lot of these Swedish records are now online, and this is William Chambers himself. You can see there he is. And amongst the things he brought back, you can see we've got some silk, we've got some tea, and there we've got 4 boxes of glass. And I think this must be glass paintings, paintings on glass. I have asked my Swedish friends and colleagues if it could be anything else, and they can't think of anything else. So I think these are glass paintings which he brought back. And the sale catalogues for the Swedish ships also survive. You can see in there's William Chambers once again buying them, buying fine pictures in 6 different patterns. Here, Chinese glass pictures being brought back as well. I think quite a lot of the early glass pictures were brought back in this way. And some of them you can see from the cost of them and from the fact that the frames are specified. They're painted frames, they're rosewood frames, lacquered frames. I think a lot of the early glass pictures came back with the Swedes. William Chambers, having changed his mind about a career, maybe he thought about it earlier, trained as an architect, and he wrote this book, Designs of Chinese Buildings, claiming that they were from originals which he'd drawn in China. Now, it's my belief that he didn't draw anything in China at all, and he derived them all from Chinese export paintings. no time to go into that now, but should you be interested in, there's an article in next month's Arts of Asia, which goes into this in a little bit more detail. So pictures like this of a Chinese interior, I think Chambers has taken it straight from a Chinese export picture. Just to remind you, he went on to design the great pagoda at Kew, which you can see sometimes from your plane as you're getting into Heathrow. And very recently, it's been restored to it the dragons, which were on it until about 1780 and were then mysteriously lost. So portraits on glass became quite a fashion, especially around about the 1770s. They often took this sort of format, a bit the same as Mr. Pike. This is quite an interesting one because it seems to have a glass painting within a glass painting on the wall there. Quite often the sea captain is pointing towards his ship out there. They come in fairly simple frames. When you see them in elaborate gilt frames, that's usually because the frames have been put on in Europe. This is an amazing thing that came up 2 months ago in Christie's. It's an ebony bookcase with a pine and teak carcass, and it's got an extraordinary display of 60 Chinese reverse glassed mirrors. I don't know how much money it made or who bought it, but nobody's ever seen anything like it. I don't know whether, as the catalogue entry suggested, it was really brought back in one piece like this all the way from Canton. It strikes me as a little bit more likely that the glass was brought back separately in smaller pieces and was put together in Europe. But anyway, it's a very extraordinary and spectacular item. Just the detail, so it's very carefully patterned, figures on the middle, flowers at the corners, auspicious objects on the sides. I'd like to have it myself. Oh, this is one of my favorites. And here we've got a Westerner in his tricorn hat and his gilt-buttoned red coat, and he's sitting at a circular table with 2 Chinese officials, and one of them in his ceremonial tasseled hat has his swan pan, his abacus in front of him, and his tobacco pipe and his folded fan, and all the little details are beautifully put in, sometimes with gilt details, the quill pen and the inkwell. And it reminds me of the kind of conversation pieces, as they were called, that were being produced in England at that time. The best known artists being a man called Arthur Davis. That's a painting by him on the left. And it seems to me that the painting on the right is kind of equivalent. I'm not suggesting it's in any way a copy. And curiously enough, you've got an Indian servant coming in from the side in each case, bringing in a message in the English version, and bringing in a tea tray in the Chinese. Once again, you've got what looks like a mirror within the mirror on the wall behind. Now, by the early 19th century, you could buy pretty much anything you liked, I think, in Canton. You could also buy Chinese export pictures of shops. And by the way, if by any chance any of you haven't seen the Shopping in Canton exhibition up above us here, I think it's the most engaging exhibition of Chinese export art that I've ever seen, so I certainly urge you to do that. Here are Western hats on display, on sale, and here's a Chinese picture shop. You go in and you can actually see the kind of pictures on the walls which you could buy. This is around about 1850 now, and most of them are oils. I think you can see port scenes up on the left. You can see pictures of Western men. On the other side, you've got Chinese women. You've got Chinese lanterns you could also buy. And here's a Chinese export picture of a Chinese export artist painting in oils, which of course is not part of the Chinese tradition, holding the brush once again in the Chinese style, but painting on a stretched canvas in the European style. And a particularly interesting artist, I'd love to have more time to talk about him, was a man called Spoilum. His Chinese name is not known. At one point it seemed that his Chinese name had been found in the Chinese records, but it doesn't seem quite to fit. And he would paint your portrait, whether you were a European or American or Chinese merchant, or even a visitor from Micronesia in one particular case. He painted you in oils quite quickly, quite thinly, with a pale passage over one shoulder. And he's a master of facial expression, I think. Wait a minute. This is Captain Watts, who was on Captain Cook's third mission, and unfortunately his logbook, which is at the Kew Record Office, ends just as he's arriving in Canton. When I looked it up some years ago, I hoped that there would be an account of his going to have a sitting from the famous Chinese portrait painter Spoilum, but it didn't happen. He paints in this very clear way, often with quite a sharp outline at the top eyelid there. Obviously the flyaway hair has impressed him, and often an expression you're not quite sure if he's smiling or not quite smiling, slightly quizzical expression. And people often say, are you quite sure that Spoilum was a Chinese artist? But there's no question that he is, and there are an awful lot of references to him in the merchant accounts. Well, drawing towards the end now, if there was one kind of painting which you would bring back and hang in your Western dining room to commemorate your success as a merchant, it would probably be a painting of the so-called factories or hongs at Canton, which were the trading bases lined up along the waterside in the western suburb, outside the city walls. This is an unusual one in that you can see over the top of them at the city and the flowery pagoda and the hills beyond. Usually you can't. Just to remind you of how the so-called 13 factories were arranged. Factory not meaning, of course, that anything was manufactured there. It just meant it's where the factor had his base. And the British over on the right-hand side had the grandest hong, and the Dutch had perhaps the next grandest. And this is a typical Chinese export picture associated with Sun Qua from the 1830s. You often find the name Sun Qua written in the corner of these pictures, and it's been assumed that he was an artist. We don't actually know that. We don't really know anything about Sun Qua. He may simply have been the proprietor, the owner of a studio, and you might have had to go in and ask to have his name put on a painting. I hope you can still hear me. Just a detail, you can see even the characters on the quayside there, two Western sailors on the left with their red and white robes, the Parsis, who were big players in the China trade, and there's a small Western boat threading its way between the flower boat and the tanker boats in the foreground. And tracing through the 19th century, looking at these paintings of Canton, you can see the changing relationship between China and Britain in particular. Here's a Chinese export drawing done during the Opium War, in which the hongs are being blockaded. Nobody is going to be allowed in or out until the opium has been destroyed, as of course it was, triggering the First Opium War. After which we see all kinds of changes to the Canton waterfront. The British are allowed to build a church and all kinds of gardens, and to bring up an armed steamer to sit outside the factories against all the Chinese regulations. And finally, the end of the views of the factories comes in the Second War, with the burning in December 1856 of the factories. Well, rather than end on that slightly dispiriting note, I've just put in a couple of views of Macau. There was a lot of interest in Macau in England in 1840, with all the news of the Opium War, and there was a grand panorama held in Leicester Square. I think this panoramic view, you can see an explanation of it at the top of that picture there, was taken straight from a Chinese export painting such as the one you see underneath. I think these export pictures were taken home and were much the best, the most detailed views which Europeans had of these places. Now, Macau was also the site of early photography. In fact, the earliest surviving photographs of anywhere in China are the views taken by the French photographer Jules Itier in 1844. And you might think this spelt the end of Chinese export painting, because now that photography had arrived, okay, it took a couple of decades before you could take panoramic views, but nevertheless you'd think there would be no room left now for the Chinese export painters. But on the contrary, the studios seem to have offered both at the same time and combinations of the two. Just got a final example here. Here's a view of about 1870, looking across from the tip of the peninsula at Macau with the Praia Grande on the right, the inner harbour on the left. I think what the artist has done, he's used a photograph, which is this one, and he's followed it very carefully, but he's been able to improve on the photograph because the photograph gets a bit dim and misty in the background, and the artist can simply paint in the details so that he's got something perhaps more attractive and interesting and long-lasting than the photograph. Well, on that slightly more optimistic note, I'll come to an end, and if anyone has any questions, I can do my best to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Connor, for the very inspiring and comprehensive lecture. So we will now be taking questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hands, and our museum ambassador will pass you the mic. At the back, the lady at the back, yes, please.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I was just wondering whether the botanical drawings and the ones of the different species, were they intentionally modeled on European models or not? That is, did the patrons show them European samples first?
Ah, yes, interesting question. Were the Chinese ones modeled on European? I don't know. That's not a very good start to the questions, is it? I'm not sure about that. You do see various intermediate stages, which suggests that perhaps they weren't. I suppose that the earliest Chinese export pictures of flowers were probably mass-produced, and they were purely decorative. And you'd stick them on the wall, you'd cut them out, you'd perhaps add a cut-out bird or two here and there, you put it on a fire screen or a bit of wallpaper. And then you see them starting to look slightly more European, and then you see the ones that are very clearly for scientific purposes. So there does seem to be some sort of evolution there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful presentation, very inspirational. I did a little bit of research myself on clay figures and clay artists from Canton. And some of them moved to England, to London in particular, to portray sitters. You talked about export painting. Did artists, painters, export themselves as well? In other words, did they come to the UK, spend some time over there? I know of some examples when it comes to clay portraits painters, but not so much when it comes to the métier that you have focused on this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, yes, quite. So the question is, did any of the export artists come to the West? I think not. Yes, there was one particularly famous modeler called Jesuit, who, as you know, came to the West and was very much feted and received by the king and did clay models of Garrick and all kinds of other people. I think we'd know about it if any of the Chinese export artists had come there. Jesuit himself appears in one of those group paintings of the Royal Academicians, didn't he? I think it would have been very interesting if they had. And there is this one reference with which Joseph Ding, way back in 1982, found in a Cantonese gazetteer to a Cantonese artist who is supposed to have come to the West. But I think the consensus of opinion now is that it didn't happen, and that it was one of these myths that gets passed on and passed around, and that the only way that the Chinese artists could have learnt to paint in this way would be if they'd actually had experience of Western art. But that seems not to be the way, that these Chinese artists didn't need any Western artists looking over their shoulder. They could do it for themselves.
Good afternoon, professors. I'm a student and also majored in the Chinese export art in CUHK now. So during my research, I found a very interesting topic is that I've noticed that some specific insect species appears on some porcelain designs of some British local porcelain factories in the mid-18th centuries. So I was wondering that is there any painting, export painting archives about the nature history before the June leaves?
Ah, yes. Did you say specific insects?
Yes, and these insects are mostly some species in the Canton areas.
Oh, that's very interesting. No, I had no idea. What sort of insects? You mean like caterpillars or?
Like some butterflies.
Butterflies?
Yes, there are like some very local species that I suppose only can found in the Linnan areas in the southern China.
Ah.
But that appears in some patterns, designs in some British local porcelain factories, like the Bone factories and the Chelsea factories in the mid-18th centuries.
In British local factories?
Yeah.
Really? Well, I know nothing about this, and that's really very interesting. I mean, I like the idea that there's so much still to be researched in the field of Chinese painting. And in fact, the whole business of the interchange between the painters on porcelain and the painters on pictures is something that really has not been, that nobody's really got anywhere with, to be honest. The Cantonese artists were painting on porcelain, I think, before they were painting on paper, certainly in a Western format. And there must have been a lot of communication between those two kinds of studio, but that's something we really know nothing about at the moment. Anyway, thank you for that.
Why? Oh, thank you for your talk. So may I ask that, are there any paintings which is purely painted on a mirror rather than a reverse glass?
Ah, yes. Are the paintings purely painted on mirror? Yes, in fact, the early ones tend to be painted on mirror, and the silvering on the back is scraped off so that you can then put the oil paint straight onto the glass, mixing some adhesive, of course, with the pigment so that it sticks to the glass. The ones which are painted on non-mirrored glass tend to be the 19th century ones, or the ones from the very end of the 18th century. The early ones, pretty much always mirror glass, yes.
So I was wondering about the painters of porcelain and on glass, but also more broadly, were these specialized different painters for doing, you show some oil painters, and then we have porcelain painters, and then we have glass painters. Did they all use different techniques, different materials? Could they be the same person, or did they have to be specialized in their training, do you think? Thank you.
Yes, Greg, thank you. I wish we knew. I wish we knew. The Europeans were always anxious to be able to identify individual artists. And I think, in fact, they persuaded themselves that they could spot the styles of individual artists perhaps to a larger degree than they could. The Chinese tradition was very much to regard painting for Westerners as a fairly mundane species of craftsmanship, not really art. And there wasn't this cult of the individual artist in the way that there was in Europe at that particular time. And there are certainly reports of mass production of particular artists, one specializing in the sky, another specializing in trees, another specializing in figures. In fact, that's not so totally different from European practice at the time. The master artist, Sir Thomas Lawrence, might just do the face, and then his minions would come along and do the background and the robes. So I think there probably was a certain amount of that, yes.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation, and it really helped those slides. And I just wonder, currently, which museum or an organization or individual is holding the best, most collection of the China trade painting?
Yes, good question. Which are the best collections? It's a little hard to know because so many museums have so much stuff in store. I read the other day that the British Museum has 99% of its collections in store. So this is a bit disappointing, especially when they're rather reluctant to give anything back. I would say the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem have got wonderful things. And I would include those. I would include them as one of the museums which I very much wish they would bring more of it out on show. The museums, perhaps in this part of the world, haven't had the opportunity to collect so much stuff. After all, this was meant to be exported back to the West. So in the last 20 years, some of it's being collected and brought back here, and I hope that will continue so that the collections out here can be built up.
Hi, Dr. Connor. May I know the paintings, of all the paintings that you've shown, the earliest year that export paintings were made in, was it like 1740, as you said?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't, it's going to be hard to say. It's going to be hard to give a particular year. But certainly the start of the Swedish East India Company in 1731 must have been a big impetus, a big fillip. Suddenly you've got these ships arriving with people keen to bring back paintings. And maybe the first time they'd bring back what was available. The second time they'd say, well, we want more like this, we want more like that. Can't you do a little bit here? And in this way, the export process, the idea of adapting painting for the particular requirements of the market would have developed. I mean, really, it's an evolutionary process, isn't it?
So as far as I understand, this is like art that was being commissioned to illustrators? Can I say that? To illustrators. Because you have mentioned painters, but I haven't heard this word illustrator that hasn't been used. But
No.
I'm suggesting, are they all called like the early Hong Kong or Canton illustrators?
Yes. I don't see why you shouldn't call them illustrators. It certainly fits some of the artists more than others. Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. The Opium Wars, so presumably they would have had an effect on trade in general between the Western countries and China. But in terms of the style of the art, did the Opium Wars have any impact? Did it change the sort of the content or the style of painting in any way?
Oh, it's an interesting question, whether the Opium Wars in themselves made any difference to Chinese export painting. I'm not sure that it did. I mean, it changed the subject matter a bit. Obviously, changed the look of the factories, and it slightly widened the scope into what was available, because now you have all the additional ports as a result of the Treaty of Nanjing. You've got Chinese export paintings of Shanghai, in particular, wonderful long views of the Bund, and to a lesser extent of Fuzhou, and then of Hong Kong. And so you start getting export painters who are not based in Guangzhou, but are now based in Hong Kong. But as regards the style, I don't think there's any very obvious change.
Hi, Thank you, Dr. Connor, for the wonderful talk and the research you have done. So, a question about reverse glass painting. I noticed that sometimes instead of coloring the whole surface of the glass, the Canton painters tend to leave some area unpainted, like leaving blank space for the sky and the window or the river. Well, I think it's very smart for the painter to play with the materiality of a reflective glass to create the effect like a matte painting that when the viewer looking at the reverse glass painting, they also see a painting within a painting. So I was wondering if the Canton painter had access to the original European reverse glass painting, or was it their very original idea to play with the material?
Yes.
Thank you.
Did they have access to original European glass painting? I don't know. I don't see why. I mean, at some stage, glass paintings from Europe must have been brought out. And the idea of painting on the back of the glass seems to have been a European idea. There are also reports in the 1730s and 40s of the Jesuit missionaries at the imperial court, Giuseppe Castiglione and Jean-Denis Attiret in particular. Attiret writes home in 1741, he says, "For the last year I've been doing nothing but paint on glass." So at the imperial court, there was also a lot of interest in painting on glass. And Attiret also says that the glass arrives on ships in Canton, and some of it gets siphoned off. He doesn't use the word siphoned off. Some of it gets sent up to Beijing for use up with the imperial court artists, and others get sold and painted in Canton. So you've got a sort of dual market going. And I think the fact that there is this interest at the imperial court as well probably helped to promote the whole art form, yes.
Very interesting presentation here. And my question is about the material, because I know that in Europe there was a change of material from hand-grounded pigments to tube paints around 1840. So in China, is there the availability of the new materials after the mid-19th century? And if there is, how does it change the scene of painting production or whatever? Thank you.
Thank you. What kinds of materials? Are you thinking of particular pigments?
Tube paints. In tubes, like what is produced
by
Newton Windsor.
Oh, you mean that people didn't have to grind their own paint anymore? They could get it in tubes?
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know. At one point when there was a lot of interest in whether a particular painting was by George Chinnery or was by George Chinnery's Chinese counterpart, Lam Qua, the hope was that if you took little samples of the pigment, you'd be able to tell which was which. And you might find that the one using English pigment would be Chinnery and the one using Chinese pigment would be Lam Qua. But unfortunately, after consultation with conservators and so on, this turned out to be a wild goose chase because there was so much interchange of pigments going both ways. Of course, there were already excellent pigments available in China, vermilion and so on. I don't know whether either Chinnery or Lam Qua ground their own paint or whether they made use of tubes, but as you rightly say, they could have done. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'd like to know more.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Connor, for this wonderful presentation. Let's give Dr. Connor another round of applause.